Anthropology. Thank you so much, Michael. I just want to thank from the bottom of Gabriela's heart and my heart, SAR, for supporting this amazing week that we've had together of scholar activists coming together from all over the world. It has been a real amazing gift to us, especially since we're the best of the 175 seminars that have ever taken place. We do evaluation research, and that was my opinion of it. It was amazing. So we're wrapping it up with this event. We've been meeting, we've been in intense discussions, we've taken breaks, we went hiking at Tent Rocks and went to museums and so on, so that's been really a nice combination. And I just wanted to describe how special this seminar is in a couple of summary words, and most important, interdisciplinary. I know that anthropology is the heart and soul of SAR, but we have our anthropologists, but we also were very careful to put together a group of interdisciplinary scholars so that we could learn from anthropology and contribute to anthropology's research. So we have epidemiologists, nurses, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, activists, public policy. I must be leaving out a couple disciplines, but it's pretty amazing. African studies and gender studies.
Historian.
We don't have any. We exclude historians on purpose. No, that's why my son is an historian, so we have our, we welcome historians. We are international, so from all over the world, but we have Ghana represented, Ghana, Thailand, Baltimore, Burkina Faso, India, New Zealand, and so on. So that has been incredible. We're intergenerational, so we have scholar activists in their 30s, 30-somethings, old people like me in their 60s and 70s, and everything in between, and we've connected in amazing ways about that, learning how to take selfies properly and all sorts of stuff. We're intersectional in that clearly our focus is on violence against women and on gender, but we look at gender in its intersections with race and ethnicity and sexuality, with caste, class, and colonialism. And we've been looking at interventions. So it's been tremendous. So we have Akosua Ampofo, who is professor of African and Gender Studies at the University of Ghana, and the current president of the African Studies Association in Africa, and a long list of things that I could say, which I'm not going to tell you about her. Jacquelyn Campbell is the Anna Wolf Chair in Community Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, and Henriette Jensen is a 30-year UN World Health Organization researcher and global force. They're going to talk a little bit about their own research and how it intersects with the topic of marital rape.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming. And I do need to preface what I'm going to say by a very big thank you to Kersti and to Gabriela for inviting me to join this amazing conversation that we've had this past week. And to Sarah for hosting us. It's been great. Making people envious with some pictures that I have sent home. So let me second preface by saying that I'm going to talk briefly about two spaces that I inhabit that bring me to research that I'm doing on young male African masculinities, for want of a better term. These days, terms can be so problematic. Like I find like I'm talking and every second word I'm having to do this. So I consider myself to be a scholar activist. My background training is in architecture and development planning, and eventually in sociology. And I think that makes me kind of schizophrenic, but hopefully in a good way. So I teach, as Kersti said, at the University of Ghana in an Institute of African Studies, and I teach two graduate, this is mainly a graduate program, and I teach two courses in gender. One is gender and culture in African society, so we're looking at the ways in which culture intersects with gender broadly, and then one on gender and development. But we also teach at the University of Ghana 5 required courses, but the oldest, which has existed pretty much from post-independence, is an introduction to African studies. So every undergraduate student at the University of Ghana has to take this course and pass it, otherwise they're not getting their bachelor's. It used to be a pass-fail, and now it carries 3 credits, I think, and it factors into your GPA. And when we're teaching that course, which also in the last 5 years has been required to have a gender component, it's become very obvious to those of us who teach the gender component, just the level of, let me say, ignorance among our students, not just about Africa and African studies, but also the ways in which our societies are very gendered in specific ways. And my work on masculinities, and I've been doing this for a while, but in the last few years, I've been a bit troubled by the ways in which young black men have been constructed, let me just put it that way, in ways that seemed to fix them as abusers, as gangsters, as they're only interested in rap music, or they're athletes. And of course, there are many different things, and they're not only a problem, okay? So I began to have these conversations recently, and I've been in Uganda, in Ghana, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Canada, in Germany, and held these conversations. So I'm interested in understanding, but also interested in intervening. And the second hat that I wear is I'm very active in my local church, and I came to my Christian faith as an adult. I was not very interested in Christianity in my early years, even though I was brought up as a Catholic. And the ways in which the church has become more of a problem, I think, in the last few years, when it comes to a number of things, but also to gender issues. And for me, the ways in which we are reinforcing a cult of domesticity, that is not even, and I'm going to essentialize here, that is not native to our communities, but is being reasserted in ways that are very Eurocentric, okay, and very problematically so. So we have these conversations, and I work with the youth in my church. And recently, and I have a lot of space in that church because the pastor is like, yes, Akosua is a good person. So we recently had a talk on leadership, and I invited a feminist lawyer, activist, who happens also to be a Christian, to speak. And she was talking about leadership, but at the end, and it was a very good conversation, and she talked about gender issues and equality and so on and all of that. But at the very end of that meeting, there was a young man who virtually attacked her and accused her of destabilizing marriage and gender relations and so forth. And this was very symptomatic of, what goes on. Okay, how am I doing for time? 5 minutes? Okay, all right. So just to share some of what is coming out of these conversations with the young men, and to let you know that there are different groups of people. So many of them are students, some of them are graduate students, a group of, I did 2 discussions in Nairobi, one with a more middle class group and the other one in what we would call a slum, among young men who were mainly artists and activists around environmental issues. The youngest group was the young men that I spoke to in Oshawa, close to Toronto, where 2 of them were just about to enter college, and I guess will be freshmen at this point. So a bit of a diverse group. But I'm interested mainly in Africans or first generation, and hoping to have another conversation in Philadelphia tomorrow, day after tomorrow, hopefully. So I'm asking them, what does it mean to be a man? Then we're talking about sexual negotiation, about consent, how they understand assault and rape, what their views are on consent in marriage, and I think in 3 of the groups there was at least one married person, but most of the guys are single. And what I'm finding so far, as I'm relying on memory and we're still transcribing the interviews, is the murkiness around consent. Okay, when is no? Do we have to verbalize consent? Some of them find this problematic, and I was sharing with the group how one of the guys said women are saying that this whole issue of consent is making relationships boring, because it's like, get on with wooing me, don't be asking for consent. The extent to which they feel that body language is very important, and some feel that guys who really understand women understand the body language, and others are saying you can never get the body language because women are giving you mixed signals and it's becoming confusing. I did not find a single person, not surprisingly, to say that it was okay to force your wife. But there were, and this is the one different group, there were a group of older men that I spoke to in Germany who basically are saying the meaning of consent travels differently. So if we were back in Ghana, we wouldn't have to go through these layers of consent. But here, if you just touch your wife the wrong way, as far as she's concerned, she'll call the police and the police will always believe her and they won't even listen to me and I might be in jail. So what we will do is, if she's always exhausted and not able to have sex with me, then I'll go find someone else to have sex with. And the last thing that I want to say is the expression that came across from many of the young men in different ways, some very concretely, but others didn't express it very concretely, is that they do not have safe spaces to be vulnerable. So, for example, if your girlfriend dumps you, it's like, why are you crying? Did your mother die? This is not a big deal. And so they deal with it by hanging out in clubs, by drinking, sports, sometimes religious spaces and so on. But they have not been given permission to be vulnerable and to express their pain. And they also have not got connections with older men necessarily. Some of them mention their fathers, some do mention their mothers as mentors or people with whom they can share or can learn from. But they do say that they know women have these spaces and women have mentors and role models to guide them on this journey to be women in responsible ways that they do not necessarily themselves have. So this is just to say something about the research as a whole, and it kind of sets a context within which we can understand a little bit more about why some young men would be abusive. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I too want to thank SARS. It's been amazing to be able to sit and talk to other brilliant women from many different places and many different perspectives, and just have the luxury of thinking and talking and having very thoughtful, in-depth conversations over really thorny issues like consent that affects our work. And so often, at least in my world of academia, I'm a professor in the School of Nursing, so my discipline perspective is nursing science, which most people are like, so what's that? At least most people know what anthropology is or have some vague idea. So I bring a health context to the work, as well as I try and learn from others. So it is hopefully a fairly interdisciplinary perspective with especially special emphasis on that health aspect in terms of what are the physical harms, physical health harms, as well as the mental health harms that come out of intimate partner violence in general, and forced sex or marital rape specifically. I've been doing this work for a very long time. I can claim oldest, I think, for whatever that's worth. And I have worked both in a global context and in the US context. And part of my context has been working with Indigenous people in the United States, in Canada, a little bit in New Zealand, a little bit in Australia. And so I would like to preface my remarks with paying tribute to the people that were first here in Santa Fe on these lands, primarily the Pueblo, the Apache, and the Navajo. There's a little piece of Comanche in there. There's some other tribes. But I think we in the United States forget all too often who owned this land first. And then of course this particular land, then the Spanish owned it. And we Americans are way late to the party. And part of what we've been trying to grapple with is the colonial heritage of much of the global South and what that has done to whole societies, and how many who have studied the global South, be it anthropologists or other researchers, have done so from a very paternalistic, colonial kind of perspective. So that's one of the things we've been struggling with to unpack. So my own work has been, my global work, first started with a group of 10 anthropologists. And we, myself and two others of them, edited a book called originally Sanctions and Sanctuary. And from looking at data that anthropologists had, and caveat about them, this was in the 1990s, so many of them had not gotten to the place where they were consciously thinking about some of the traditional anthropological perspectives and how colonial they were. But I think those particular ones were less of that. I do know they were all feminists, so they cared a lot about gender, and they cared a lot about what they called, all of them agreed on the term, wife beating. And the Sanctions and Sanctuary framework that we derived from that work is the notion that there is a difference in most societies between what they call wife beating, we would call ordinary domestic violence probably, which would be fairly low levels of hitting, fairly low levels of sexual abuse, not much actual rape, the way it's defined in this country, and probably more psychological abuse, emotional abuse, whatever you want to put that bucket in. So that's most domestic violence in the United States. However, there is some that is what some people have called battering, what some people have called severe domestic violence. What I have looked at in terms of how much of that is likely to escalate to a domestic violence homicide. And so that type of violence in all of the studies that we had anthropological, all of the countries and societies that we had the anthropological data from, that was considered crossing a line, from ordinary wife beating to something else that the community needed to intervene in. And what we saw all over those societies is that where there were lower levels, where the line was back a bit, in terms of the wife battery, the severe forms of domestic violence, that it was more likely to include marital rape if it got severe. And where there were lower levels of that really severe wife battery, there were both sanctions, community level, community decided on sanctions against that wife battery, and some sort of sanctuary for abused women. And, you know, in the United States, that's a domestic violence shelter. In small scale societies, it's something totally different. So that was the premise of this book. It's been an interesting framework to try and work on. We've applied it to some other countries in contexts with varying levels of support for it. But that's been the crux of my work and where the marital rape fits in.
Okay, good evening or good afternoon, it's not yet evening. I also want to join my previous speakers with thanking SAR for giving us this great opportunity, but also the organizers, Kersti and Gabi, who really made it very special and brought together this incredibly amazing group. So I also want to acknowledge the group and the amount of things that I've learned from them, because I come from a different discipline. Again, we all come from different disciplines. So we rarely have a chance to have this type of in-depth discussions or, you know, exchanges with other disciplines that can help you enrich your own work. I'm working for the UNFPA. That's a UN organization, and it's if you are not working in the UN, you may not have heard it, but it's the UN Population Fund. It's an organization that works especially on reproductive health and rights. And it works globally, but I work in the regional office in Asia and the Pacific. And we cover 37 countries in the Asia and the Pacific region. And I haven't been working there all my life, but I can't give you all the details of my wide and breadth career. But I've been in UNFPA, let's say, for somehow the last decade, first mainly as a consultant. And when I was about to reach retirement age, I got funding for a project from Australia to pass over my knowledge, or pass over, you know, to roll out or to develop. They called it, they used the words, we want to clone you. We don't want all the knowledge that you had in, I mean, that's what they said, the knowledge that because I had 20 years of experience of data collection on violence against women around the world. So I've literally been in like at least 35 countries on the ground collecting data on violence against women. And a lot of that knowledge would get lost because there's not many people who have been doing what I'm doing. So I got a project, you can see the logo there, that's No Violence Against Women Data, which says it means you have to know the data in order to be able to end violence against women. So with that funding, I got a project for 3.5 years, which is the biggest component of it is on capacity building, in developing a curriculum, partnering with institutions, transferring the knowledge, rolling out. I mean, you can ask me afterwards how we do that, but because that's a completely different story. But it's a magnificent project. It keeps me very, very busy. But my talk will be about how do we measure violence against women when we measure it in a quantitative way. This is work that started about, in an international level, in a cross-cultural level, about 20 years ago. It's really still a very young field because until around 2000, most data that we had, quantitative data on violence against women, was from the US, Australia, Canada, and from a few, India was one of the countries that had some data, but there was not much data and not collected in a comparable way. So I worked at the time, I was asked by WHO to help developing a methodology, and I will talk a little bit about that methodology. But in measuring prevalence, the word prevalence of violence against women, we try to get a quantitative impression of how widespread it is. And I want to explain a little bit more how we measure prevalence. But before I go there, I also want to say we are now in a world in which a lot of the work by the UN, but also by all the countries, is driven by global mandates, global conventions, we have the global agenda for the Sustainable Development Goal that has a whole lot of targets and goals and indicators to measure. And some of that is quite scary because there is so much attention for data in a way that sometimes moves the attention away from what really is important, and that's doing something about it. So a lot of my work is also on data literacy, and also I would call it in this private group damage limitation, trying to see that own data should never be our goal. But okay, moving forward, prevalence data is really about counting people, counting how many people experience something in a population. It's not counting numbers of events, but when we talk about violence against women, you count the number of people that have experienced violence, for example, in their life or in a certain time period. And if we talk about partner violence or spousal violence, you count the number of people who had ever had a partner and measure how many of those have experienced certain types of violence. So when we measure in a comparable way across countries, most methodologies look at prevalence in a lifetime, how many women have ever experienced something in their life. So if you hear, you have the campaigns like 1 in 3 women have ever experienced or will ever experience physical or sexual violence by a partner. That's a lifetime prevalence. It doesn't say how often it happens, but it says, so in this room, if we have here 20 women, or let me make it easy, 10 women, then 3 out of 10, for example, have experienced physical or sexual violence in their life. And that's a bit the global average that we find around the world. And then we measure current violence. That's violence in the last 12 months, which is part of lifetime prevalence. It's not a separate thing, it's a subset of lifetime, but that shows you how many are currently, for example, in need of services, or how urgent is the problem at this moment. So I will say very little about this, but just saying, if you want to measure prevalence, you can't rely on police data, for example, because we know from all the surveys that we do that it's usually between 1 or 10 women that ever go and ask and report to the police. So you need surveys, you need to ask every woman the questions to find out how many in that population have experienced something. And when you do a survey, you have to design a representative sample of women to get that prevalence rate. And there are a couple of methodologies that do it, but because of limited time, I skipped that. So how does that look when we ask these questions? To measure in a comparable way, we don't even ever use the word violence in the questions. We ask very specific acts of violence, behavioral acts, so that it's not up to the interpretation of the respondent, the woman to whom we ask the questions, to decide if it's physical violence or sexual. So we ask literally, have you ever been slapped, kicked, pulled your hair, dragged, threatened, and so on. And for sexual violence, there are also those questions. Have you ever been forced to have sex when you didn't want to, or because you were afraid of what he may do, or were you forced to to participate in an act that you found degrading or humiliating, and so on. I'll skip that last one. So I want to show you some data for the Asia and the Pacific region. Asia and the Pacific region has 37 countries, but we don't have data for all countries. But for a lot of countries, we do have data that has been collected through surveys in a relatively comparable way, mainly by two of the methodologies that I mentioned. And the balls represent here the lifetime prevalence of physical and/or sexual violence by a partner, at least at some point in their life. And the inner balls, the orange balls, represent current violence, violence in the last 12 months, and you can see it's part of lifetime, but it shows you the women that are now living with violence. And I find representing this in this way very useful to explain regional differences and patterns for storytelling. Of course, it hides a lot of difference, but it gives already quite an interesting story. And you can see, for example, that in Melanesian countries, like Timor-Leste, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, the balls are big, but both lifetime and current violence have big balls. So women who live with violence, at least, or who ever experience violence, most of them are still currently living with violence. If you look at the ASEAN countries, the ones that are circled down here, you find that those balls are smaller and that there is much bigger difference between lifetime and current violence. And in the South Asian countries, there is much more variation. But if you look, for example, here at Afghanistan, that's a country where practically every woman who has ever experienced physical or sexual violence is still currently living with physical or sexual violence. And if you compare that with Marshall Islands, also 51% lifetime prevalence, there's much fewer women are currently living with violence. Just quickly adding in some of the developed countries. They are not countries where UNFPA works, but people always ask about them. And we see here Australia, 1 in 4 women have ever experienced physical or sexual violence. But if you look at the current violence, it's only 1%. So there is something completely different happening in Australia compared to, I think it's Palau that I circled? Palau, where the inner ball is bigger. And this really shows that it's a very limited picture that I'm giving you, but it already shows you that prevalence rates vary a lot, and that but it also shows that when we analyze it further, we can find entry points for prevention, because we can find out why it's different, and it doesn't need to be the same everywhere. What is also the case is that we still have countries without any data, and there are always issues with comparability. And one of the messages that I give when I teach on data literacy is that people also really need to understand how they have collected data, because even with the best of methods, you never get the worst. You never get the women who are killed, the women who are institutionalized because of violence, the women who are incapacitated because of violence, the women who are too afraid to open doors, too afraid to talk. So you never get that story, and you need to understand that to understand your data. So do I need to stop here? I can stop here, but I have stopped. I would want to do one more slide, and that's this one. That the data, the methodologies, no matter how good your questionnaire, no matter how good your translations, the quality of the data, and it depends really on your interviewers. And the best methods put a lot of attention on interviewing. And one of the things that I think when I train interviewers is reaching that level that they can see, collecting the data, is an exchange of gifts. If you give your heart, if you empathically listen to women, if you value her stories, if you make her feel worthy, then you can collect the data that I mean, women never tell. That's painful, that's stigmatized. And this makes it so different from any other type of surveys that people do. And thank you for giving me the extra minute.
This may not work, this mic.
Don't move over there, stay over here.
Okay.
That's why you did that.
All right. And that's loud. And I don't have a volume.
We got it.
All right. So I don't think I can talk because I will get feedback because of the volume. All right. So I think it's, no, still no, because I don't want to blast anyone's ears out. Is that a little bit better? You can hear me now? All right, so I think what I wanted to do at this point is do a couple of things. One is offer the three presenters, which are really showcasing just a small amount of the expertise that's in the room. And I would invite you to actually engage with the other seminarians because the breadth of knowledge that they share is quite amazing. Just offer a number of questions for them and then collect a couple of questions, and then what we'll do with the participants up here is actually ask them to respond to one, either mine or yours, so that we can wrap up in a timely manner. So I will collect 2 or 3 questions, but first offer a few of my own. From the presentations, I think it's quite clear that gender norms become included in the research on sexual violence in different ways, right? So if we look at the way that Akosua's presentation, hers is really explicit about the way gender comes to be included. And less so in the more quantitative approaches. But I think gender runs through all. And so my question would be, in which way might your way of conceptualizing gender in your work change as a result of this seminar? Another question that I would have, and this is more tied to the current Me Too movement, in the United States, is around the issue of consent. Again, consent, whether it's methodologically, right, whether it is that it is built right into the question that you ask participants in the survey, or whether it's something that you ask in an interactive focus group, right? Consent, it really undergirds much of the way that we study sexual violence. And what I would ask the participants would be, does consent really cover the harm of sexual violence? The full breadth of the harm of sexual violence. Can consent actually do that? That would be one of the questions. I think the last question that I want to offer of my own is a question of really asking you, if you were going to choose one, and there are many problems with doing cross-cultural work, right? If you were going to choose one problem of doing cross-cultural work that you think needs further research or needs resolving, what would that problem of doing cross-cultural work be? If you were gonna say, okay, this is the one we have to tackle, what would that be? And so now I would like to open up and collect to see if you can give us questions of your own for the panelists to also consider. Yes?
It sounds like you haven't been doing this for a whole lot of years, maybe 20 or so. But I'm curious as to the trend here, as to whether things might be improving or getting worse, and why, over time.
Thank you. Is there another question that anyone might want to ask? Yes?
What I'm really interested in is a definition of marital rape, sex without consent, but I'd like a clear definition, if that's possible. It's a big question.
Yeah, you know, we spent possibly 5 hours
And I'll take the answer.
discussing the bounds and merits of the term marital rape. But I will leave that to them if should they choose to take it up. It's a really important question. Both are really important questions, actually. Is it getting better? Is there another question that someone might want to ask? Yes?
I wanted to know how much the culture that the people are living in dictates what the definition would be for consent or violence.
Great question as well. Also something that we spend quite a bit of time circling around. Yeah, so you can choose to answer. We can start with answering one of the questions. And
Okay, so excellent questions both from you and from the audience. As one who has been in it for a very long time, yes, it's getting better. So, you know, globally, in the United States, there's less of intimate partner violence. The data would show that. There's less of marital rape, I think, although that data is not as clear, mainly because we don't have comparable definitions about how we measure that. But
Less murder.
pardon?
Less murder.
There's, you know, the worst of it is homicide. That's part of the work I do. There's less of it. But it's still not measured very well in the global south. It's not, you know, documented how often it happens even in many countries. So, you know, with that caveat, where we know about domestic violence and domestic violence homicide, it has gotten better, which is the good news. Part of why the perception, I think, of the public, be it here or elsewhere, that maybe things are getting worse is because more women are talking about it. You know, are telling somebody, even though in many countries, as Henriette said, the majority of women have never told anyone. And I loved your last slide. I thought that was awesome. One of the things I try to do in my own research is to collect the stories as well as the numbers. So I get both qualitative data and quantitative data. And of course, integrating them, making it all make sense, having the resources to do that in an informed way is all part of the problem with research that's going on now. One of the questions was, does consent capture the harms? No, that's easy. No. So next. but as we struggled with, consent is a really, really difficult thing to unravel, especially in Me Too, and there's many different ways that that has been understood around the world. And I finally want to say that as a result of, I think, of this discussion, the book that will come out of this, which is like the follow-up book to the last edited volume on marital rape, I think will be far richer far more connected. Watch for it in about a year. And we'll be sure that the SARS community knows about it coming out. So I'll leave the rest of them to people who took better notes than I did. Lost it.
You go well taking the questions. I mean, like, I wanted also to say a bit more of if things are improving. Yeah, from this global data, for many countries, we have only one data point, but for the countries where we do have multiple data points, yes, it does look that programs are having effect. But there are also countries where there's no change yet. But it's promising. In our region, we have
Afghanistan.
Yeah. But in the Americas, for example, I've seen a recent an article that's being a reviewed article that's going to be published hopefully soon. I saw data that shows that it's improving in quite a few countries. So that's good. I mean, what has hugely changed in the 2 decades is the way we talk about it. I mean, 20 years ago, nobody talked about it. And from data from Vietnam, before the first study was done, this type of study that I'm talking about, the survey, most people were really not aware that domestic violence was happening behind those closed doors. A fair few people knew, but I mean, the government or even the general public wasn't aware of that. So having surveys, having data helped very much in this change.
Can I add? I'm sorry. The biggest challenge I see to our current state of research in the world is that we have really privileged, reified, whatever you want to call it, the quantitative.
Taking all the questions.
Well, you can answer it even better. And stripping it of context. And that's something we talked about a great deal. And especially with very fancy multivariate techniques, which I actually do, but I worry about how it's done. So expand on that.
Question on and also, about the harm. I mean, I'm not taking the difficult ones like the definitions because, as you said, that can take hours. But in the surveys that we do look very much at the health impact, the impact of violence as well. And we find, for example, sexual violence, intimate part, what we call marital rape in the context of this seminar, has huge impact on mental health, on suicidality and so on, much more than physical violence. Whereas physical violence has more impact, of course, on injuries and on other general health outcomes. But if women experience both physical and sexual violence by a partner, those impacts are much higher. I mean, it kind of adds up. Can I give you the floor now?
I'm also going to say something about the change and try and link that to the Me Too question. And let me speak just for Ghana and say, first of all, we don't have enough data going back long enough to say, have things changed, like have they changed from when? And I'm going to throw some anecdotal things out there, which for me suggests that I'm not sure if it's necessarily getting better. I don't want to romanticize, our communities and our societies, but to just take an example of what we would describe as matrilineages. In other words, families that trace the lineage through the female line, and not to be confused with matriarchal, or to say that women have all the power, but it's just the way you trace your family line and who you inherit from and so on. And because families are traced through the female line in matrilineages, and that make up about 40% of Ghanaian groups would be matrilineal, 45. It meant that from an instrumental perspective, families had an interest in intervening, in poking their nose in your business to see what's going on. Because let's take a family where there are 5 brothers and maybe 2 sisters. That family line continues if the sisters have children. So there's also an interest in the family that she should marry well. So for example, when we talk about arranged marriages, yes, arranged, but we're looking, will this couple dance well together? And so as brothers, if my sister's husband is messing up with her, I'm interested in making sure that, maybe she's misbehaving and it gives her a slap. But if she complains that there's sexual violence going on or it's too brutal, we're going to jump in there, and if it gets too bad, we'll take her away from that marriage. It's like, okay, give our sister, give our daughter back to us. That's breaking down because most African countries are urbanizing very fast. So that link between the family of origin, so to speak, and couples, that the nuclear within the extended family is becoming more separated, which means that we are not as likely to know what's going on or to jump in. From my own experience going to college in the late 70s and 80s, there are things that my students are telling me today, and I'm like, what? So a couple of years ago, I brought some young women together to discuss what does it mean to be a feminist. So it was to be a feminist. And they're telling me stories about what's going on in the dorms. Like when I was a student, young women would sleep in their boyfriends' dorms or vice versa, and women would cook for their boyfriends. Cooking is kind of a thing in showing affection. But now I'm hearing things like, okay, there are these 6 students in a group and there are 2 women, and the women are cooking for these 4 guys who are not their boyfriends, but the boys are going to study and coming back, and the women have cooked and the boys will share that information. And it's like, okay, this is domesticity so deep at such a, why, basically, why are we doing that? Because one of the reasons I think is because marriage or a certain kind of marriage is looking more acceptable and you must be in it, and we're also getting these messages from certain very powerful preachers about the importance of marriage and how inadequate you are if you're not married, and the guy is the prize. And so young women are tolerating a lot more nonsense in these relationships. So this is kind of to throw in the anecdotal. And then to say, as we discussed over the last few days, how problematic consent is, and definitely not, it's not the only way to look at it, and what does consent even mean is problematic because we are speaking different languages as the people who are in relationships, and I used to head the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy at our university, and we did do some kind of surveys among students. And the issue of, to kind of draw out from women at what point is it consent, because in the initial conversations there, yes, we consented. And then you dig deeper and it's like, no, they perhaps did not consent. And these relationships are not only with their boyfriend on campus, but very often with slightly or older men who are coming onto campus to date them and are jealous, and I bought you an iPhone, and why are you using it to text this other guy and slap the air? And their friends are seeing this. And do you report it on campus because the boyfriend is not a student on campus and he's not a lecturer? So yeah, consent is, you have to dig very deep, one, to find if consent happened or not. And then, who's defining consent just like who's defining marital rape.
I know there's a pressing question at the back, so, yes.
Thank you very much. It really helped us to understand the complexity. It's interesting that we had this question. It's getting better or getting worse? Because I recently attended a conference in immigration, and one of the discussions was about the emerging of this nationalist movement. That it happened in the United States, Philippines, Italy, Brazil. Do we see any correlation? Because a lot of the discourse it had to do with a lot of control of sexuality and the power involved in keeping together the state. Do we see an emerging in terms of a new type of different or perpetuating forms of violence because of those discourses?
I've actually written a paper on this.
Oh, really?
I actually, yes. So I actually wrote a paper that was just recently published on the links between authoritative language of tracing the authoritative language of Guatemalan dictators to what is called mano dura, or strong-arm presidencies in Guatemala, and looking at the way that those notions of masculinity and masculinity attached with authority that is absolute actually delimits women's participation, or enforces a track of women's participation in politics, and also tends to put women's participation in politics in the same track as the bodies of victims of sexual violence. So the objectification, the ways that the objectification takes place for women participants in politics is very similar to the objectification of women's bodies that have been sexually violated and displayed in Guatemalan newspapers. So there is absolutely a link. There's a new book on Brazil, actually on Latin American populisms, and the way that Latin American populisms also use authoritative speak. So I think there is a link. There is a particular form of masculinity that relies quite heavily on the violation of women's bodies and its display, right? And we can see to create nations, actually. And we can see certain parallels, which I'm not going to continue on, but at least in the Latin American context, that is absolutely clear. You can see it in the evidence in Mexico as well, although people haven't quite tied that in a single article together, but if you tie multiple articles together on Mexico, I think it's quite clear that this is also a process that's happening there, that the bodies of violated women are at the essence of creating particular kinds of nations, right?
And so is the othering of other groups, and the particular group that gets othered depends on the country and context. And I also wanted to say one other thing that occurred to me around cultures, your question, that one of the things we have talked about is that culture is not static, and that, what we think of as cultural norms around masculinity, etc., is oftentimes written about as if it's static, and it's not. Those change also, and I think that's one thing, when we do cross-cultural work, one of the other things that's a big challenge.
Can I also answer one more question which wasn't answered yet? You said what would be one problem besides that one, which is complex in cross-cultural work, and in my work of measurement, of quantification, a lot of, the imposing frameworks ask us to measure a lot of things in a comparable way across cultures. And even, I showed you only physical and/or sexual violence, and I didn't show, for example, psychological violence, controlling behaviors, what was mentioned, or economic violence, because we do not know how to measure that in a comparable way across cultures, because these types of violence manifest themselves quite differently over time, but in different parts of the world. But somehow, the frameworks are asking people more and more to do this, and it's quite problematic, because we really don't know yet how to do this accurately, and even sexual violence is already very difficult. So psychological becomes more difficult, economic becomes more difficult. But it doesn't mean that it's less important, because most women that we speak to in surveys, many women say, well, that he beats me or that he wants to have sex, I can live with it. But the way he fucks with my brain, that is much worse, and we find a lot of mental health consequences from psychological violence. But it's much harder to quantify.
Can I say what, I mean, I've been thinking what might be on my wish list, something to look at cross-culturally, and just because of where I am in this moment and what I'm doing, I would be interested in looking at the performances, and that when I was sharing my work, some of the feedback and questions came about the homosocial, which to explain is like how the guys perform for the others. So I showed some film clips, and we could see when some of the men were speaking, the approval that came, on the faces of the others. And I would be interested in seeing that, how that plays out cross-culturally. And as I watch some of the debates and the occurrences in the US around how some prominent men have performed, their sexual, whatever, deviance, assault, and the responses in the press, and what you see is about the homosocial and what's going on, good for you. Your penis is performing. And I'd be interested to see how that travels.
In the Judiciary Committee, for example.
I know that there's one last question, and I think in the interest of time, this will be the last question. Yes?
Let me see if I can articulate this. So, one of the things we're looking at is the violence against Native women correlating to extractive industries close to reservations, often close to reservations, or indigenous communities. So my question is, how is the research approach and the data collected that looks at colonization, culture, context, and change, and how do you disaggregate that across, globally?
That's a very interesting question.
Can you come to the seminar?
And I think that's a very difficult question, in fact, because we as researchers, right, one of the things that was the intended outcome of this seminar was to really think through what could be practical things that we could propose, practical interventions. And I think one of the key practical interventions that we wanted to pull out is the importance of actually having researchers from the communities, right, begin to do some foregrounding their work, right, and to try to figure out which methodologies for doing that work, for gathering that data, might be suggested by communities themselves, right? Because to do this work on changes, and this is not my idea, this is an idea that we arrived at together, right? I think being able to have partnerships, research partnerships, I think that is how we might approach looking at cultural change in a more nuanced way, and in a more community engaged way. And I leave if other people have other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and having done some work in this geographical area with indigenous peoples, and other people have done it in their societies. And it's not just, like in the old days, we used to give people that were from a group a voice, but they didn't necessarily lead the, cooperative process. And that in the work I'm doing now, I'm trying to make sure that my partners in this work that are indigenous are actually leading the process. And, that has challenges for me, especially in terms of time, because I'm like, gotta get going, boy, I've done me through, But even so, it has far enriched what we're doing. That it's not just that they have a voice in it, they're leading it. they're leading the process. They're deciding how the data gets collected, from whom it gets collected, as well as, you know, what it's supposed to be about. And so I think that's one of the things we have to do. And in the notion around psychological abuse, that it's really contextually, has to be contextually defined, culturally defined. You know, there's problems with both of those words, but you can't solve them right now. But I'll never forget one of the students that I worked with did some work in Tanzania amongst women, and she was trying to get a handle on defining, in this case, psychological abuse, but the definition of marital rape is also, you know, one that we need to have the people, the women, tell us what that is in their context. But one of the quotes I'll never forget from this is this one amazing Tanzanian woman says, it becomes abuse when it hurts my soul. And I thought, you know, that really captures it for me. Yeah, that's the harm, and that's, you know, it hurts that deeply. And that's when it becomes unbearable.
Yeah.
While, you know, calling me names or whatever kinds of things he might do, you know, we might call each other names. But that's when it becomes a harm that's serious enough that for that woman at least, and for that group, the whole group agreed that made sense, was when it was abusive.
Well, I think on that note we will end, and thank you very much for giving the topic of sexual violence in marriage the importance by coming. We really appreciate it.
Please join us for a reception right out here. And we're going to delicious things to eat and more conversation.